Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, In Touch, curated by Megan Young. Today, we are thrilled to present artist Pipo. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, so feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks everyone, and welcome people.
Good morning. It's such an honor to be here, and thank you so much for taking the time. I know we all are so busy. To begin with, I want to start by saying thank you to Megan Young, who just curated such a beautiful show, In Touch, at the Rife Gallery. And I want to thank Kat and Panagiota, who's been just stellar at trying to get me to organize. And then the Ohio Art Council for their generosity for supporting so many of my projects throughout the years. And I just want to give a shout out to Kathy, who I have been talking to for during the last several decades regarding to my projects, and she's extremely supportive of what I have been doing. And of course, to my family, Phong, my wife, Elan, always collaborative, kind of, collaborator, and Asia and Quentin. And I want to give a huge thank you to Vu Nguyen, who without, his help, I wouldn't be able to finish this project and having it shown. And, he has gotten this project, the hotel, to where it is right now. And then, of course, to Oberlin College for supporting my work, and the studio art faculty, and then the lab, which is like where I teach. I'm speaking to you from my studio, just to give you a little kind of idea of like my setup, how everything is situated. And today, I'm gonna try to answer a few things before I jumped in to talk about the hotel. And as I'm trying to prepare for this talk, it's just became so abstract that they became like a bunch of floating words. And in answer to like some folks who ask me, what do I do? It's really difficult for me to explain. And some of the ideas that I think about is, of course, identity. I think about my work as really autobiographical, and it's driven by the idea of cultural authenticity. I don't think myself as an artist really, but I think of myself as a storyteller. I want to talk about otherness, and within the kind of post-colonial discourse and of specific sites, which is Vietnam and the US, and how my work adjusts to different sites as I travel between the US and Vietnam. And of course, through all of this, there is this underneath sort of definition of how others see me, at least when I first came to America, which is defined by the Vietnam War. And in my practice, photography is really kind of like the main focus. However, I think about performance, I think about installation as well. So as far as the hotel go, which is the body of work that is being shown at the Rife Gallery, it is a project that deals with me returning to Vietnam, which is what I have been focusing on. It's not so much about my assimilation into the West, but my question, which I have been really kind of involved and focused on during the last, 20 years, is what happened during my return. What is my new definition of home when I actually return to my home, right? So this is about looking into life in Vietnam through a curtain in a hotel room separated by a glass sort of window. It's kind of a metaphor for the clarity, or sometimes it's not so clear how I can navigate or how do I see that culture that I came from. And the definition of home is kind of ironically defined by the hotel room, which is, of course, reserved for tourists. On the left, it's just a photograph. My first photograph, actually, from the series. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, seeing life through the curtain, and then sometimes the curtain opened up. Sometimes life is kind of steaming down there, strange scenes that's happening. That seems normal to folks who live in Vietnam, but for me, almost as an outsider with the privilege of speaking the language, of being part of the culture, I can see these things as something that is otherworldly and very strange. Oh, the pictures on the right-hand side, it's a group of people getting ready to go and advertise for a Vietnamese beer brand on the street. So they're gonna ride these women around while they wearing this costume and I guess waving like these beer bottles. My work is really autobiographical. I mean, it's really driven by the complexity of my growing up with a household that is straddling between the French culture and the Vietnamese culture. Both of my parents are educated by the French. My sisters and all of and my names, we all are kind of being named after these French nicknames. So Mimi, Fifi, Gigi, and then Pipo. And then how so much of like my thinking when I'm, when not so much, but like as I was growing up and like being in America and then going back to Asia and thinking about like how colonialism has really shaped the way that I think and as a colonial subject, what should my work be addressing? And of course, in coming to the US, so much of who I was or who I am is still being defined by the Vietnam War, which is, totally understandable. And then this is myself when I came here as a Vietnamese refugee at the age of 13. So I was also educated under the French system. I spoke French before I came to America. So I came without a language. I didn't speak French well, and I didn't really know Vietnamese, that well either. And so somehow when people ask, why do I do these things? And, why do I do art? And I think, because it's one of those things where I have chosen that particular language in order to make these kind of abstract questions visible because I lack the language skills in French, in Vietnamese, and in English to address these questions. I didn't do photography. I didn't start making anything until I was about 30. So I was very late in the game. But then what it is, there's a certain kind of like, I guess naivete, but then at the same time, there's a certain kind of urgency once I have discovered this particular language. So this is one of the work that I made in this series that I applied to graduate school, and it really addressed question on my beginning of the quest of asking what is identity, or like more specifically, who am I? So in this one, it's the work is really we're informed by looking at work by Lucas Samaras, which is like this fantastic artist that I saw his Polaroid, how he's scratching on top of it. Christian Botansky, who installed work that dealt with the Holocaust. And then, of course, Francis Bacon, who to me made these incredibly psychological paintings that I was able to relate to. And I went to graduate school, still looking at all of this work and thinking about, wow, all of my sort of like early graduate work was kind of informed by my influence by Christian Botansky, installation, dealing with trauma, with the war and such. But as I was introduced to a series of Asian American artists, such as on the left-hand side, you see is San Quan Chi in one of his more iconic kind of image where he posed in front of the Statue of Liberty as this sort of cultural ambassador from the West, from the East. And then Te Ching Xie, who does these year-long sort of performances that dealt with, I think, his life as an immigrant, as an illegal immigrant, as whose interest is, I think, is about like stamina and endurance. And to me, it spoke very clearly to my interests as I was raised, you know, to be an athlete when I was younger. I was a national athlete in table tennis for Vietnam. And I was introduced to Margot Machida's sort of writing and her collection where she gathered all of these Asian American artists into these series. For the first time, I think I was able to relate to the way in which these folks were working, the kind of issues that they dealt with, and how all of these separate voices were brought into this one structure. This is when I found out work by, you know, by the painter Hung Liu. But really, you know, San Quan Chi to me was someone that was really influential to the kind of thinking that I was going through. And, you know, with an amazing thing is that, you know, years later with her fourth book, I think I was, you know, I made it to the cover. So it was really great. So I just owe a lot of what I'm doing now to these folks who actually have given me a voice. About male representation, I look at these all of these American, you know, these male Asian American artists and read work by Yukio Mishima that really dealt with the body and of like what maleness and of representation and what does it mean. I also look at John Thompson's work, who is this Scottish photographer who traveled to China during the 19th century and photographed these, you know, very spectacular scene. And what really drew me to his work was the series of condemned criminals. And to me, these condemned criminals, they're like the other, you know, within this from their culture. So being an Asian male, I think trying to adjust to the West and to the US specifically, we deal with kind of like complex stereotype. One on the left is, you know, straight out of a kung fu movie. And as you know, we are just badass kung fu, you know, Shaolin monks. And then on the right hand side, which is like a 19th century kind of like rendering of an Asian person, an Asian male, where, you know, it just seems like it's more of this kind of like genderless, almost, you know, very submissive sort of character. And embracing like the idea of maleness and representation and of, you know, being Asian, some questions about authenticity sort of began to like rise up within my work. This is my first sort of like serious body of work. It was titled 1,000 Deaths. And in this thing, I performed these kind of, you know, this photograph. In this photograph, I became the condemned criminal who was like ostracized from his culture, but then is being viewed from a Western audience as the other. In terms of like the writing on here, it's not really authentic, but I just thought, you know, doing something that is like the script and kind of look like Asian characters that would just give this work a certain kind of authenticity and giving myself a certain authenticity of being Asian because Vietnamese, we write in regular alphabets. So this work, I think, you know, was extremely influenced by my reading of Yukio Mishima. And then, you know, those are like, these pictures come from like that in-between place where, you know, I was not quite sure what I was going to do, you know, having come off of this kind of like long period of like working on 1,000 Deaths. So I did this fun thing where I just use this polarized faded so you can't really see. So I will have to describe it for you. this is the last Chinese takeaway where Jesus is at the center. All of his disciples are like, surrounding him. And then Judas, who's wearing black, he's Asian, he doesn't have any hair, is the one that's pulling out the wallet. And on the table itself, there are scattered Chinese to-go food containers. There's some cans of Budweiser's on the table. It's really funny. And I thought, you know what, this could be something that I can pursue. But like, let's talk about my process of assimilating into the West. In some ways, that could be, can address the nuance of it. It could be a tragic comedy. Sometimes it's sad, sometimes it's funny. And then how do I see myself within this grand narrative? So a natural kind of place for me to think about it is looking at art history. And then thinking about how do I see myself in a panel by Jan van Eyck, So like given the stereotype of a typical Asian male, can I represent myself both as a female and a male? And then at the same time, the work is I was trying to bring the visual language of Asian theater onto these stages, really. And these images then get finished in this really ornate frames to signify that they are from like the Renaissance. On the left is a picture of myself with my son Asia, who was 3 months old, is of course the Madonna and Child. And then on the right-hand side is Mercury. And Mercury, of course, is getting ready to fly, to run and jump. But then these are like these spring shoes that probably he's gonna do a face plant. And moving to the West, this is when I moved to Oregon with my family at the time. And moving and going to Oregon, I was extremely aware of like that kind of brutal history of Asian immigrants and how they came into the culture, get persecuted. And my response to that work, is is to start researching on the archive and seeing how these images were being represented. And so, images from the 19th centuries of Asians were either, they were coolies, opium addicts, or prostitutes, or there's nothing in there that I felt like I could identify with. So my idea was to subvert that narrative and somehow to use my self-portraiture to like deal with this. I would begin to take on these roles, typical kind of 19th century, tintype or daguerreotype of the general, the boxers, and in a way alluding to the Siamese twins, Chang and Ang, this like really famous kind of Asian performers during the 19th century. And even like in one of these daguerreotype, as this Asian man is holding, is actually a portrait of a Caucasian woman. And as I was working on my earlier project, I received this grant, right? And this grant is for me to go and be an artist in Giverny, in Monet's garden. And so I was just thinking about if I was gonna go to France, this is a place that means something. This is like the motherland as a colonial subject. How should I address this sort of tension? And I think originally I was proposing to do an image of the 7 samurai having a showdown with the Magnificent Seven in this particular garden. However, as I was thinking about it further and further, I thought that, it would be better if I can just address this idea of colonialism by just staging a colonial expedition to France, where I would just liberate or take back as much as I can in this theoretical kind of display for a Vietnamese natural history museum. So another expedition dealt with well, it's composed of earth, water, and seed samples that I have gathered from Monet's garden, as well as 1,200 cyanotype that I made during my stay there of the actual plants and flowers that was being grown in Monet's garden. So this is just a typical, image. These are just straight out of the garden. Felt like I get up early in the morning before the gardener came and gather this specimen, and then I make this exposure during the day. And it was an obsessive, very obsessive kind of work. As I have mentioned, I produced 1,200 cyanotype of this particular for this particular project. And then the installation for me was a pseudo natural history museum kind of installation of what we have liberated or stolen from the French. So you have cyanotype, covering the walls, you have seed samples, you have water samples, you have earth samples that were like being collected from Givagny. So, I think it's like to answer some of the questions, like, people have asked me in the past, what kind of photography that you do? It's really difficult for me to answer specifically because, as you can see, like my work kind of changed. I think like as I travel, as I arrive to a new place, I think ideas came up and I would choose whichever materials that would be suitable to speak about my ideas. So installation is definitely really important in my work, and with the work that I dealt with earlier, such as the Another Western, the museum is very specific to the kind of audience that I wanted to address because I really want to subvert the kind of narrative and change history with like the kind of work that I was producing. And then this is a third chapter of like my earlier kind of work, which is the idea of, the immigrant or the refugee or someone who has left the culture. Now he's coming back home. Is there such a thing as home when you come back to where you were born, right? After being far away for a long time. So assimilation, my first project is about my assimilation into the West. Another Western is about my assimilation into the US. And this is about me going back to Vietnam. And this 2 million step is a calculation that I made. If I had walked between, the West Coast, going back to Vietnam, and the idea of where it's home, I think, in these site-specific performances, this is what I thought of them as, it's the question of, yes, I'm standing on the shore of Vietnam right now. This is Ha Long Bay, but I'm looking straight to the US. And here I am that, someone who is wearing a traditional Vietnamese áo dài, which is a long dress. But the strangeness is with the addition of a life vest, which I thought is like it signify a boat person, someone who have left Vietnam through, by choice, but like, as like a refugee or someone who actually have made a conscientious decision to leave Vietnam. And going back to Vietnam, it was really interesting because I just realized that I was no longer Vietnamese. I mean, even though it was amazing all of this time that I've been searching for the familiar air, the kind of humidity that my body can deal with, the viscerality of just being in that particular culture, I no longer fit, right? I mean, the closest one, I really wanted to return. And as a stateless immigrant before, in my 20s, the closest I was able to get to Vietnam was India. And so just thinking about this first project, it really is the beginning, is like the seed planting thing for me to just keep returning to Vietnam to work and to try to answer some of the questions that I had regarding to like what is home and what is this liminal space that I have found myself into between the West and the East. And then 9/11 happened. And, that's when I abandoned like my sort of like self-portraiture and began to think about, how do I talk about my narrative? How can I relate my experience from Vietnam as having grown up during the war, of having been shot at, of having family members, being killed. How do I address this? And so I was thinking about, yes, just re-examine the landscape, thinking about looking at the Hudson River painting, where, there's such an incredible, hopeful and positive um, kind of idea that exists within the landscape, but now there are like some tension and imminent sort of like danger that's being presented into the landscape. This is my first photograph. It's called Mountain Fire, and it's of my son standing in front of this raging mountain fire. And, of course, it's really reminiscent of Caspar David Friedrich, the painter, who for me are just so relatable because of the fragility um, and the of like my son, of like dealing with this raging, uncontrollable kind of natural phenomenon that I was kind of relating to, like the 9/11 and like of the war, thinking about like how would this impact my son and like other people. And during this time, naively, I came up with a project to address the 30th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. And this was like so important in terms of like my how it has shaped my kind of creative practice. During this project, what happened is I sent out a mass email because, at the time there's no GoFundMe, none of that. And just asked folks to just like, pass this email around. But like my idea was just to buy a motorcycle for somebody who is, not privileged, a cyclo rider perhaps that I don't know. And if it's feasible, if that person agree, then he would use that motorcycle as a taxi to ride with me from the bottom of Vietnam to the top of Vietnam. It's like, kind of like this idea of two long lost brothers and how they have reunited and now they're going to see the country together. So like, it's so naive. It's so problematic. I mean, there's a lot of problem with it, but then at the same time, I felt like there was a lot of good things that came out of it. The way that I work is now is how do I involve the community, and like how do I address what's in it for my sort of like, the people that I photograph or I work with, as far as, would be, he opened a business, his wife, he has enough money to like open a coffee shop. There were like these things that I have begun to address. And so that's like my desire to go back to Vietnam to work these days. Since 2005, really, I have worked in Vietnam strictly because I felt like with my work, in some ways, I was able to give back to these folks that, these folks that I was able to work with, who were like so generous with like what they have done for me. And during the course of this Motorcycle for B, I continued to work on my East of Eden project, but using the subjects that grew up within that landscape, who's familiar with this landscape. This is pictures is called the Lotus Pond. And this is of my friend, another motorcycle taxi rider. And this is of his daughter. The idea of this image for me was just, how can one generation protect and like raise another generation within this kind of damaged Garden of Eden. And then I got caught up very, for another 5 years working on another project while I was in Vietnam. And it's really a homage to my brother. This is my brother, by the way. And he's an amputee from the war. So like for 5 years, I just travel around the country looking for amputees who fought in the war and just recorded. I don't know what the purpose of my project were. However, I just felt like I just had to do this recording, more like a documentary portraits of like these folks who share the same kind of circumstances as my brother. And in a way, once I start doing this project, I just felt like I just cannot return to the US to make photograph because there's a certain viscerality that I experience when I look under my focusing cloth onto like this 4x5 screen to see a damaged face, to see someone's wounds so visibly in this air that is extremely heavy. It's kind of a rush in a way. But then at the same time, when I was doing this work, I don't want to photograph these people to kind of like magnify their wounds, but I want to photograph my subjects with grace and with pride. So after 5 years of doing that, I just thought I really needed a break. So how about another project called My East of Eden, where I seek to address my lost childhood in a way. These kids are like the metaphor for like what I was not able to do during the war. So they're running around, they playing, they doing games, but then at the same time, there are still remnants and there's still certain kind of symbols about the war that I want to address. So they are just kind of obscure. But now the Eden for me is like has been regrown. This particular space has to do with the sites that was like heavily destroyed by Agent Orange and such. But now, 30, 40 years later, it's grown back, it's lush again. And so I just want to address this sort of new generation of just like growing up in this Eden and what would they do? I mean, so, I think like the project is a little bit more optimistic. It's still talking about legacy, but it addressed the idea of responsibility and of hope and of regeneration. And this is my project, the hotel, which is what is being shown now. So I want to talk about this as a very site-specific work because, it's a place that I actually spent 3 years of my life being just obsessively just photograph these images. And I just want to show you this is like such a busy street. I mean, it's wall to wall of traffic. There's a market right here. So it's just a very fortunate sort of incident for me that I was able to discover this hotel in this little alleyway. And this alleyway is unique because the architecture has been kept, it has been raised, and they do not allow folks to sell things there. So the street is still kind of, relatively empty most of the time. This is a kind of a setup that I had. I mean, the hotel room, because it was an accident. I mean, the hotel owners apologized to me because the room that I supposed to rent was given away. So they just wanted to give me this temporary home that they don't use actually. And it's because it's just so tiny, it's just enough for a bed. As you can see from the bed to the window, it's just barely for my tripod to like fit into that space. But the moment that I saw this room, I just thought it was so perfect because it allows for me this kind of commanding view, a typical viewpoint when people were like doing survey during the 19th century when they have discovered some place that they need to map out. So as you can see from the street, depends on like the movement of the curtain, I can either be completely visible or invisible, right? So like, but like for 3 years, after a while, I think like folks just get used to that crazy guy that just sits on the window and photograph us. It's like, so some folks I see from morning till night, some folks I photographed for 3 years straight for every day, the neighbors actually. I mean, I know exactly what their routines were. So it was kind of creepy. I mean, of course, but then I was just really thinking about mapping, about somebody who's traveling, of someone who's like trying to get to know my culture, to map it out, to really figure it out, depending on like the view, how far the curtain's gonna open, how when it's closed, and what is that gonna look like for me. There are some spectacular. I mean, some of these scenes, I mean, I couldn't dream of. I mean, it's just so strange. It's very normal to everyone who actually lives there. I see folks walking by these scenes without even blinking their eyes. So the location is there is a factory, that they kind of like replicate kind of classical paintings. Here's the Mona Lisa. Right in the alley to the right, there's this place that rent out sort of costume for theater costume. And across the street out here, it's actually there's a theater school. And because of the uniqueness of this space, you can see like the colonial kind of like architecture moving to like the US in the 70s, moving toward like the more contemporary home, moving to like these kind of high rises. I just felt like I was just in this interesting valley that dealt with the whole history of Vietnam. And this is where folks come to have their pictures taken. This is when models and photographers come over to have their pictures taken. Interestingly enough, at the front of the alleyway, there is this place that sells beef noodles, but then it doubles as a modeling agency. So, which seems normal to everyone, but I thought, wow, that's pretty strange. It kind of reminds me, or like it really is directly kind of, tied into the work that I was doing before. I spent 7 years photographing every day. This series of abandoned sort of greenhouses in Ohio, and just with just like the pleasure of watching, the pleasure just kind of sitting and just watching the world go by and just recording like the sort of subtle changes that I was really interested in. And it was just like such an obsessive kind of like work that I can relate to. I think as an athlete, this is a performance that I did called Ping Pong, which is take place in a motel room. And this deals with, I think, like representation of like, maleness. But like, nevertheless, I did this thing for 3 hours playing ping pong against a robot. And it really, I thought about like that performance at Tasting Share. There's like 1 year performance where like you have to really stay in there. So with the hotel, of course, I was looking at Richard Misrak at the time, where he photographed these incredible, images of folks on the beach from his hotel balcony. And also, I think Mary Alpern would be like someone that I may have thought about. She's a person who photographed into this bathroom windows of this strip club in New York City. And so having lived in this space, being photographed, really having this routine of photographing from 6 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night without leaving that room, and being like completely tight in that little, I would say 8 by 10 room, day after day. I spent a total of 6 months there, a little bit more than 6 months in there. However, just so incredibly obsessive. And I thought about the idea of how can you make work with this sets of limitation that is like a window, the curtain, and things that's happening all around you. I mean, it looks exciting, but I have to say, most of the time, it's like fishing where you stay there for the whole day and nothing happened. The moment, of course, when you turn around or you have to go to the bathroom, crazy things happen. So that's what I was, left with. It's almost like going on a long drive and not being able to talk to anyone, but just having your brain that you can just have conversation with. So this is, of course, I was trying to hurry back to Vietnam for the new year. You know, this is like anytime that I get off, I would just fly back to Vietnam. And it's an archive. There's a lot of work in this, you know, project. And I was just thinking about, oh yes, you know, it could be an installation of just like the maps of how motorcycle travel into this alleyway at night. So, you know, the curtain became really red at night just because the neon light goes on, you know, when it's nighttime. And then sometimes I would just photograph the day as it's passing through, you know, the sun and the curtain and how the form that it made onto the curtain. And I just thought it was just so beautiful. And then of course the space, and you know, the folks, I don't want to say specimen, but it's like I like that kind of work. It's just kind of this obsessive kind of recording of this cataloging of like these folks that just like passing by. So this is my installation, the first one actually of like this project at Space a few years back, where you can see like these archetype details are like being shown with like the larger sort of like images. And you know, to get close, and you know, of course, life changes, and you know, I've tried to be so close to Vietnam, and you know, maybe I thought, you know, and then I met my wife, you know, I met my girlfriend, and I thought, wow, you know, the idea of home collaboration, and maybe I can get deeper into like this Vietnamese culture by, you know, having my Vietnamese wife. So this is our wedding, and of course, this is like when I first met my wife, and so at the start of the pandemic, I had to return to make sure that she was okay. Just like all of these folks that I was stranded with and being placed in the quarantine with, we were all there for a certain reason. And for me, it was about going back just to make sure that my wife was okay. And this project then, you know, begins like kind of my idea of just like really photographing these liminal spaces. These are all the different kind of quarantine rooms that they have their door slightly open in the afternoon to get the drafts. And I would just photographing into these room just to think about, you know, how these temporary homes are made, how strangers actually came together, and how the kind of habits that they have made cohabitating with each other. And then, you know, going back for 10 days just to make sure that my girlfriend was okay at the time turned into this 11 months of being stuck in Vietnam, which for me was like the most incredible time of my life because I really get to know this country so much better. And so as, you know, I have a partner who's Vietnamese, now I felt like there's a certain issues or certain questions that I can begin to ask, such as like intimacy, right? So like this is a series that I made of sex hotels. And I was just thinking about intimacy in Vietnam as the culture is really shifting. We have more privileged folks, there are more money, but then there's still people who don't have enough money. So in terms of erotic fantasies and such, you know, who's able to afford like, you know, what's 180,000 dong per hour room look like comparing to like a 30,000 dong per hour room? And then I thought, you know what? If I am correct, it would be really difficult for me to find what is like this kind of erotic fantasy, given the fact that we have grown and still exist under a certain kind of, you know, colonial kind of condition, where a typical scene would be something like this, where a Caucasian couple would be embracing to like set the stage for like this erotic fantasy. So that's like my project. And some current projects that I'm working on. This has been going since 2005. And it's really just a series documenting people, places, more like a catalog, more like a travel catalog and my experience of like being in Vietnam. And so I would just like end my talk there because we just hit the 40 minutes mark. So I would be more than happy to answer any of the questions that you may have.
Great, thank you, people. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and pop those into the comments in the chat. And so, people, you have a really incredible history of variety of kind of lives lived. And I'm curious if you might talk about how each of those lives lived affect the next portion of your work. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes, I mean, I feel like it's not like I live an incredible life. Really, it's not. Because it implies like, consciously you do that, right? But I felt like things just happen beyond my control that I found myself in these places that instigate a certain kind of conditions, I mean, being a bartender at Live Cafe in the East Village during the 80s was just incredible. I didn't realize it at the time, but like, of course, it has shaped the way that I've thought, the kind of folks that I saw that's like, I've seen that just normal, just like everyday life. It's like Basquiat and Keith Haring and those folks. Now that I've found out like they're just incredible folks. And so like those kind of conversation, watching these folks live, I think like all of it, it's just kind of, all of these things have shaped the way that I think. I mean, I think I have time and reflect, and then at some point they're gonna resurface into like the kind of questions that I may have. Oh, I think I forgot to like show this one work, which is like it's something that it deals with like a whole, my idea having this question of like in my family background, we are mixed with Dutch from like the 17th century. And so when I went to Amsterdam, the kind of questions was like, wow, it's like with my mixed ancestries, how do I deal with this, right? So like this is a project where I put a gold frame around myself with like wearing like a, long traditional long dress with like this, neckwear that's typical of like the Dutch sort of like family portraits and just grab whatever that's around and make like a kind of a silly kind of funny kind of portraits, but they, to answer your questions, all of this somehow kind of inform my work, and I'm not so conscious of like how they do it, but I feel like my time, I mean folks that know me know that I had spent time in a monastery and with the Tibetans. That also is like shape and inform my work a lot through like just kind of looking and waiting and patience and stamina and of just sitting and just like breathing and just like looking. I feel like I try to not compartmentalize all of those like different chapters, and somehow they will kind of be a part of my practice. I don't know if I answered your question, but
I think your answer is great.
great.
We have a question from Eve, who says, Pipo, what an honor to witness some of your history here. As I continue my line of work, I think about the queer image as a deconstruction of colonialism. But I run into the issue of attempting to deconstruct colonialism with a very colonial tool, photography. How do you reconcile photography's history with your attempts to create documentation, or as you said, add to the post-colonial discourse?
Oh man, such an amazing questions. I mean, I feel like, yeah, I feel because of like my practice. To me, the most important thing in a photography practice is who's doing the looking. It's not necessarily the tool. I mean, I feel like, it's the eyes, is like the gaze. I think like the camera is the instrument, and it's only recording like what we are gazing upon. And so I think that's like my question is about, yes, it was invented as like a colonial rules. I mean, a colonial kind of tools from like, um, to recording such, but it is who's doing the looking and the intentionality between the looking is what the crux of like this conversation is about. I don't know if that answered your question, Steve.
All right. I think we have another question from Danica. Hi, Pipo. How do you stay committed to your projects for so long, and how do you decide when they are completed?
Whew. Just to say, my East of Eden is 12 years. My garden is like, 7 years of every day. So like, yes, they are. My short ones are like 3 years, 6, whatever. Yes, and I think it has to do with obsessiveness and of trying to see how far you can push your ideas and can you see it to the finish. Because to me, questioning is about addressing all the nuances, and it's not about arriving as a statement, as a conclusion. And so I think that that and I mean, I think like so much of of what my work is about is, my sort of background in doing sports. It's just about how do I push myself to like the brink of almost non-existent sometimes by like doing that kind of work. And honestly, I mean, I feel like because I guess I have such joy and I know like my privilege. And I think because I came to art so late, relatively speaking, that I just found so much pleasure in doing the kind of work that I do. I guess, the questions that I have are kind of serious in nature, but the way that I approach it, the kind of story, the people that I meet have given me such joy that I think about it as just seriously playing, So it just kind of stopped when I felt like that urgency and just like the joy of having discovered like these tools and like of this voice and like the way that I think, it's been so amazing that I just stay with it. And as I mean, Danica is like, a project stop. A project stop when I get bored, when I feel like can learn everything from it, right? I mean, for my identity work, my self-portrait, I mean, everyone at the time just pushed me to do that work. And I felt like the vocabulary was like really set. I knew exactly what I was doing from one image to the next. I knew it. I knew it. I know my formula really well. And it's time for me to move on. And that's how, I mean, I didn't know anything about color photography, say, but I thought everyone was just having fun with it. Okay, I'm gonna learn. And then, I didn't. But like, I was like, the learning part is what I was like really thrilled about, the process. It's not about like the result, but just like the process of like driving yourself, of learning about this, about like it's about researching. I guess that's the kind of stuff that propels me. And when the conclusion comes, it's like there's no interest in it anymore. When I feel like I'm known, enough of that. So yeah. So I guess, I would just say like my, creative practice in like my head is so much more important than like for me to like come and with a shape of like a product and of like a name.
I love that answer. I think that's incredibly helpful for all types of artists to root through the importance of their work, what it brings to them. Panayota would like to know, what are the differences for organizing and planning a photo project in the studio versus a travel photo shoot?
Ooh, do you know what? So this is like really interesting because yes, studio is great because it's control, I mean, all I have is like my makeup per people, my shooting people, whatever. I mean, it's complicated, but it's actually, and but like at the same time, I actually bring my studio out into the real world as well. So like, I need people to like hold lights. I need, but like it's really interesting. It really depends. I think like with my last, my projects when I was working in Vietnam, is that a lot of the things that I was doing, I had to rehearse so much in my head because there is like a very limited amount of time that I can actually produce work before the police or like the secret agents come for me when I'm doing this kind of work. When I do the amputees or when I first started doing like the project with the kids, that, yes, so like the urgency of like having someone chasing you and like gonna put you in jail is different from actually having time to set up in your studio, so, and with the hotel, I have all the time that I can just do my work. So it just really depending on like the projects. And I don't know if that answers your question, but like it really depends on the project, and the urgency of like making that project. I mean, it sounds so dramatic, but like, yeah, I mean, I had to actually bury my film underground and trying to escape like the police and all of that kind of stuff, and a certain kind of project. So for those kind of projects, when I go and make a portrait, I have about 7 minutes to do it. Right. So like I know like what the post, I know the communication, I know like exactly what has to happen, but yet still having to rely on the person or like to like do something that was unexpected. And and I love, I feel like my work is a lot of collaboration, it's like and I love that when I work in the studio, the people that I work with change from time to time, even in this under the same project, so that it gives like a different flair and a different flavor to like the kind of work that I was doing. I mean, I feel like, you know, uh, it would be really silly for me to say like I make this work, whereas like I felt like, oh my gosh, I address and I hope that I address the fact that none of this work is like I can make by myself. Really, it's just
Mm.
like through so many folks.
We have another question. What do you hope people take away or learn from your documentary style photo series?
Ooh, you know what? Documentary. I guess with the documentary, the hotel to me is like kind of documentary, right? It's like the amputees is definitely like documentary when stage. The documentary. Wow, I mean, with me, I just felt like, the tools are like the way that I think the documentary thing is for me is like such a beautiful, such a privilege and chance to kind of interact with the world and like figure out like what other people's stories are. You know what I mean? To like figure out like how different these folks are and how not to prejudge anything, how preconception, yes, I mean, we all have preconception because that's how we survive. But then, be open to surprises and like, incredible stories that you would never expect it. I mean, I have discovered, I mean, I feel like in my process throughout so many different things that I've done, I have discovered how ignorant I am about other folks sort of like idea, how my preconception of who they are have proven me wrong time after time. Who I have expected to be selfish and violent toward me actually were like my closest friends and like people who have the different complete beliefs from me turn out to be the most generous folks that I have been able to like share my life with, So yes, so I don't know if I answered your question, but like, that's my experience.
That's great. And then this will be the last question from Eve. How does your experience with immigration change the way you view your masculinity? The concept of masculinity has come up a lot in their peer group. What does assimilation mean for your gender expression? You said you were condemned. How so?
Um, I'm sorry, condemn.
Yes, condemned. So at some point in your talk, perhaps you use
Okay,
that language.
sure, sure. Huh. Do I that identity is so interesting because now we have like terminology and like we have definitions, Whereas like when I was growing up during my like creative practice time, we just like, okay, you know what? That's just Sang Kwan Chi. He just like does what he does. We all know that, he's gay, his partner is Keith Haring. He does this, he does that. He photographed a Vogue, but then he's an artist. So like I think like with those things, they kind of float a little bit differently. And in terms of like immigration, it's really interesting to me, Eve, that you asked that question because the idea of maleness and all of that, it's almost like you know, if I was to go back to Vietnam, the idea of like maleness becomes like so much more rigid, right? So much more rigid. And yet, right? In Vietnam, men can sleep together and hold hands because it becomes like intimacy between like friends. Whereas like when I remember when I first came to America, as I'm walking with my friend and I'm trying to hold his hand, he hit my hand because he's like, don't do that in America. Do you know? So like it really depends on the context. And I, you know, and so, you know, with like, you know, so like with immigration, I don't think so much about immigration, but like I think like, yeah, let's, you know, about like cultural kind of like definition of like maleness and like of like otherness. I feel like, you know, it just the context shifted. And I think the questions became nuanced and it has to flex and adjust to the new environment.
That's
I don't know
great.
if that answered your question, Eve, but
I think
I
it's
know
wonderful.
because like, you know, a lot of people have addressed, and you know, it's interesting. People have, you know, addressed my, you know, myself, me as a queer artist or like as the cyanotype guy or like as a documentary photographer or, you know, and I understand all of that. And I don't deny any of that or I don't embrace or accept any of that. But then at the same time, I felt like, you know, in the way that I have lived my experience, like I in some ways I kind of don't like to be bounded by like a certain kind of definition. You know what I mean? So I'm all of that, yet I'm like none of it really.
Perfect. Thank you again, Pipo, so much for the generosity of your time and talent. And thank you all for joining us for this Artist Talk by Pipo as a part of our programming for In Touch. I'd like to give a special thank you to curator Megan Young. Also a big thank you to all the participating artists, as well as the Ohio Arts Council's board, the legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you.